We're looking at the last of the organic molecules today. We're going to look at nucleic acids. So first I want to do just a little review. We are talking about the organic molecules that make up living things. And so far, we've looked at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and now our last one is nucleic acids. So far, for these three, you should know what elements make them up, and you should know what their monomers and what their polymers are. And so I'm going to do a little chart with that, and I'll add nucleic acids in, even though it'll be a preview. So if we're looking at elements, this one is probably easiest, carbohydrates. So for carbo, that's carbon, sounds like it. And then hydrate, you can think of, oh, I'm really thirsty, I need to hydrate myself. That would be water. So water, you should know, is made out of H2O, and that's hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. And so carbohydrates are made out of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we'll write element above this column. Lipids are the same, almost. They also have carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, but they have them in a different ratio. So if you look at carbohydrates, if you have a carbohydrate that's big and has 100 carbons, there would be 200 hydrogens roughly, and roughly 100 oxygens. Not so for lipids. They have these long chains of carbons with hydrogens sticking out of the side and only really a few oxygens. So you can write little or few oxygen. When we get to proteins, there are some new elements. So you still have the same ones. You've still got carbon and hydrogen, and you still have oxygen, but there's that amino group, and that means there's nitrogen. So all proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. There are some amino acids that have R groups that have sulfur in them. So there are many proteins that also contain sulfur, but they don't all. So that's why I'm putting sulfur in parentheses. We have not talked about nucleic acids yet, but I'm going to fill in the chart so that you can do this ahead. Go ahead and fill this in maybe in the back of your notes. You're going to want to list the molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and then make a column for elements. And the nucleic acid elements are going to be almost the same as proteins. So we've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. We haven't talked about the nitrogenous bases that you find in nucleic acids, but we'll do that very soon. So they have nitrogenous bases, so that gives them nitrogen. And then the only difference, and this is an important difference, is that they have a phosphorus in their phosphate group. And so nucleic acids have phosphorus and proteins have sulfur. So if you look at all of the, you should know all of the elements that are commonly in living things. So that would be CHOMPs. And this is something you should memorize. It's almost always on the MCAS. CHONP, make that a P, S. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are the elements that are commonly found in organic molecules. So there might be a question that says, there's some plant that a scientist found, blah, 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 and they did an analysis of the elements that are in it. And they found carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. And this other element, what would the other element be? And if one of the choices is nitrogen, then you should pick that. So these are the common elements that are in all living things. They certainly are in different proportions in different living things. And there'll be some other elements that you'll see also, but these are the most common ones. So you should memorize that. The other thing that you should know is monomer versus polymer. So we'll do this in class, but the monomer for carbohydrates is a monosaccharide. The monomer for lipids is a little tricky because steroids are a little bit different, but in general I'm going to say glycerol and fatty acid. The monomer for proteins are amino acids, and the monomers for nucleic acids are nucleotides. So that's something you should memorize as well. So I'm going to write that in, monosaccharides here. So you can make a list up here. The title of the list can be monomer. So the carbohydrate monomer is a monosaccharide. There we go. Sorry, I'm writing it on top. Okay, so monomer is the general term, and all of these have monomers. The specific monomer for carbohydrates are monosaccharides. For lipids, it's a little tricky, but I'm going to put glycerol and fatty acids because that would be what's true of most of them. So glycerol. Glycerol is that 3-carbon molecule that I showed you. So glycerol and fatty acids are those long chains of carbons with hydrogens, and there's a couple of oxygens at the end. Glycerol and fatty acids. Now here's something that students get confused a lot with. Lipids are made out of fatty acids. Nucleic acids have the word acid in them. And proteins monomer are amino acids. So try to keep all those different acids straight. When we looked at chemistry, we looked at what an acid is. It just donates a hydrogen. And so that doesn't mean an amino acid is much like a fatty acid, except they do donate a hydrogen. So they make things acidic. So what was I writing here? Should be amino acid. I'm trying to write acid. Oh well. Okay, so amino. So the monomer for a protein is an amino acid. And the monomer for a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. So you'll have a chart like this that you'll have to fill in. You'll also have I don't have enough space, but you'll also have a column that'll say polymer. So the carbohydrate polymer is a polysaccharide instead of a monosaccharide. The protein polymer is a polypeptide instead of an amino acid. I really wish this were a monopeptide, but it's not. They're called amino acids. And then the polymer of a nucleic acid you can just call a nucleic acid, or you can call it a polynucleotide. Either way is okay. Lipids, it's kind of hard to say because lipids are like a junk drawer of different things. It's everything that does not dissolve in water. So this group is a little bit tougher to assign monomers and polymers to. Okay, so that's the overview. Now we're going to look more at nucleic acids. So the major types of nucleic acids are DNA, RNA, and ATP. DNA stores hereditary information. This is the information for making all of the body's proteins. And so all living things have DNA as their hereditary information. Viruses are not considered alive, and some of them don't have DNA for their genetic information. They store their genetic information in RNA. But for every living thing, that means everything that's made out of a cell, DNA is the thing that stores the hereditary information. Traditionally, we think of RNA as the thing that reads the DNA and makes it into proteins. So the DNA is in the nucleus for complex cells, and if it's a bacterium, the DNA is just there in the cell. The RNA is made from the DNA, so they're very, very similar molecules, and there are enzymes that can read DNA and make RNA from that. So this reads the hereditary information, and then from that we make proteins. Proteins are really important because they make up most of the structure of your body, and then some of the proteins are enzymes, which can put together the carbohydrates that your body needs for structure and the lipids that your body needs for structure as well. So when I look at you, I'm looking at your proteins and the things that your protein enzymes have made, your carbohydrates and your lipids, and they're all directed by the RNA, which is directed by the DNA. So the DNA is the original code. From the DNA you make the RNA, and from the RNA you make the proteins, and the proteins make everything that you need. The thing is, this is a little bit simplistic. RNA actually has a lot of regulatory functions as well, but what we're going to be doing is complex enough with it. ATP is the last molecule that we need to know for nucleic acids. That's an energy molecule. It's actually a nucleotide. It's the monomer. And this is such an important molecule that it's going to get its own small unit. And these are such important molecules that they're going to get their own big unit later on. Nucleic acids are polymers made up of nucleotides, which are the monomers. So here's a polymer. It's DNA. And there's a pretty complex monomer. And so the monomer is actually made up of three smaller things. So when we looked at carbohydrates, their monomer was a monosaccharide, and monosaccharides were sort of it. This is a little more complex. The nucleic acid, in this case DNA, is made up of nucleotides. The nucleotides are the monomers because these are the repeating units that you see over and over again. But even these monomers aren't simple. They're made out of three smaller things. They're made out of a sugar, a phosphate right here, and a nitrogenous base. Here's the reverse one. Here's a base, a sugar, and a phosphate. And so this would be another monomer or another nucleotide. So taking a look at just one of these, I have it right here. There's the sugar, the nitrogenous base, and the phosphate. And so the thing that's kind of interesting about this is a nucleic acid actually has carbohydrates in it. So this carbohydrate has carbons, hydrogens, there are oxygens. This is a sugar, and sugars are carbohydrates, but this isn't a carbohydrate, it's a nucleic acid. So that's kind of a different thing. This nucleic acid has a different monomer in it to make up part of its monomer. So here's the sugar, whoops, well, I'm going to show it to you again. The parts of a nucleotide, there's the phosphate group, and that's the one with the P in it, that's the phosphorus. And then there's a pentose sugar. Pentose, if you remember what a pentagon is, it's a five-sided structure. If you remember what ose means, that means it's a sugar. So pent is for 5, so it's a 5-carbon sugar. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you would think the other one would be here, but that's an oxygen. Here's the 5th carbon. So this part is the sugar. And remember, a sugar is a carbohydrate, so it's got oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, 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 more oxygen here. And the thing about this is a carbohydrate, but this whole thing is not a carbohydrate. This whole thing is a nucleic acid, so it's a nucleotide. And then there's this nitrogenous base. So there are 5 different types of nitrogenous bases. And sometimes I just call it a base because I'm lazy, but the nitrogenous part means there's nitrogen in it. So there's a nitrogen here, there's a nitrogen here. And that's just one of the bases. There is adenine, that's one of the bases. We usually just put A. Thymine, which is T, that's found only in DNA. Uracil, U, that's found in RNA only, not in DNA. And then there's cytosine and guanine. So these you'll absolutely have to memorize. There are 4 nitrogenous bases in DNA, A, T, C, and G. And there are 4 nitrogenous bases in RNA, A, U, C, and G. So these are the only 2 that aren't found in both. The sugar is also a little bit different between DNA and RNA, and we'll talk about that when we get to the DNA part. Again, this is showing you a monomer, and here's the polymer. So the base and the sugar and the phosphate, you can also see here. One thing that is interesting about this is it's the base part, this part, that's sticking out. So these things in here, all these parts, this is all the nitrogenous base. This part is the sugar phosphate, sugar phosphate, sugar phosphate, sugar phosphate. So this part makes up what we call the backbone, this blue ribbon-like thing, or this blue ribbon-like thing. Those things that are the strong parts on the outside, that's made out of this, sugar phosphate, and then another one, sugar phosphate, a sugar phosphate. The things that are sticking in the center, those are the nitrogenous bases. That's this. This is the part that's different. So this is the part that reads A, T, C, G, G, or whatever it is. And that's the code of life. So if I go A, T, C, G, G, and yours goes A, T, C, G, C, your code will be a little bit different from mine, which will make something about you different from me. And here's what they look like. Again, I think I've got to stop here. I'll show you this in the next.